Hello everyone, welcome to another video from Religion 101. I am Jacob Berman. I am again joined by Daniel Unterbrink, the author of Judas the Galilean and Judas of Nazareth, um, and like a couple other books. And we're going to be discussing Judas the Galilean, but also we're going to be discussing something else that we didn't really touch on last time, Saul the Herodian. So, getting into Saul the Herodian, we're going to be discussing a bit of the research that was done there, the comparison between him and the biblical Paul, also him killing James, uh, apparently killing James, and also the interesting thing about Stephen and his parallel with James and Acts. But Daniel Unterbrink, just to reiterate, in case many of you haven't watched the first interview, which I'm sure many of you haven't. He also claims that Judas the Galilean is essentially the historical Jesus, or Jesus is heavily based on Judas the Galilean, noting, I believe you numbered it 33 parallels, something like that.
At least, yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting parallels, especially with Luke, the tax revolution, like Jesus turning the table of the tax collectors. So we'll get back to some of that, but why don't you start us off with Saul the Herodian, what you think about him and how he relates to this whole thing?
Okay, it's really, before we even think about Jesus, since the New Testament is heavily dependent on Paul's writings and his letters, it's important to get a timeline for him. Traditionally, the timeline goes that Jesus came in 30 AD, was crucified in 33, and then a couple of years later, Paul was brought into or Saul, who became Paul, joined the Jesus movement. So you would put that around 35 AD. And in Galatians, Paul mentions at least a 17-year gap or time before when he joined the movement to the council in Jerusalem. So you can use that 17-year period also in figuring out when he actually started. Okay, there's one passage in Josephus that's very important. It's about the conversion of King Isaetes. And what happened is a fellow named Ananias, and that's also an interesting name because he was who brought Paul or Saul on the road to Damascus and was part of his conversion according to Acts. Anyway, he goes in around 44 AD to King Isaetes and tries to convert him to a superior form of Judaism, which is essentially Paul's version of Judaism. It was without circumcision. And there was a person that was sent from Galilee, Eleazar, who combated that, and King Isaetes actually then got circumcised and became a full Jew. But there was that battle between Ananias, which was Paul's vision of what?
Ananias of Damascus?
Well, whether it's the same person,
Right.
the same name, but it has to do with the conversion process. Okay.
Right.
So, okay, we're talking now at 44. There's conflict between Ananias and Eleazar. Then you look at the book of Galatians, and you got the exact same thing going on between Paul and James and Peter.
Right.
Cephas. Okay. That's traditionally been figured to be in the 50s. But if it's the same time as the Antiquities passage, it's in 44 AD. Okay. So at 44 AD, even Paul admits that the Jews had turned their backs on him. Okay.
Right.
So he is now essentially out of the movement. And this is in 44. Now you take that 17 years and then go back, you're at least at 27. Okay. And you're probably another 5 years earlier than that because after the Council of Jerusalem, Paul starts preaching his message to the Gentiles. So there was probably a time span, whether it be 1, 3, or 5 years, or maybe even more, that he is going around trying to convert Gentiles to his new version of Judaism. Okay,
Right.
so you take that all the way back, we're probably getting a conversion of Paul into the Jesus movement in the early 20s. Okay, so then that totally screws up the timeline for Jesus, because
Yeah.
he's supposed to have not come on the scene till 30 or so.
And that would
So
imply,
we
and
got
that,
we got some big problems with the timeline if you use the Josephus dating on what was happening in the book of Galatians and at Antioch. So number one, if people see that and then they start really starting to think and then look at some of the other things that Saul in the book of in Josephus's writings, you can see that that same Saul has been incorporated into Acts' version of Paul.
right.
So it's and you spoke earlier of the
Stephen?
Stephen and the James parallel. In the Stephen account, Paul is introduced at that point as Saul, and that was probably in the early mid-30s, according to the Book of Acts. Okay, so and Stephen is stoned, and it says there was a person that was giving approval who was Saul, and then Saul started to persecute the church. Okay, in actuality, according to Josephus, this Saul started persecuting the religious Jews, or what you would call the Jesus movement, after the stoning of James in 62. By that
Right.
time, remember, I'm saying that in 44, Paul has been removed from the movement. He's no longer, he was hounded by the Jews, and finally he went off on his own. I don't know what he did, but by 62, he's in Jerusalem as a major player with the high priest and Annas, and not Annas, but well, I guess it was Annas,
Ananias ben Ananias.
Yeah. So he's dealing with the big shots because he was from the royal family. He was a Herodian.
Right.
So he's out there. He's making money. He's persecuting the church. But this is in 62. Okay. So between 44 and 62, there's a good chance Paul headed back to Jerusalem and was hanging out with his family.
Right.
Okay. It's a totally different. The book of Acts has cleansed his actions and made all his persecutions pre-conversion as opposed to post,
Right.
being released from the church or removed from the church.
Yep.
So, that's the important thing about the timeline with Paul, because and you got to look at what Christianity is today. It is essentially the teachings of Paul.
Yeah.
Not so much there are some of the teachings of Jesus, or as I would say, the historical Jesus was actually Judas the Galilean.
Right.
But they were fanatical Jews, as we would look at them, and they gave their lives. Josephus talked about them as being, they would endure all sorts of torture by put to them by the Romans. And we envision the early Christians, the Gentile Christians, as being this group, but it was the fanatical Jews that followed Judas the Galilean. So we have a problem today in that Christianity really doesn't follow the actual messianic figure. They follow Paul, who was a convert to that, and he twisted the message of that Jesus into his own message that um, was more palatable to the Gentiles because they didn't have to get circumcised and they also didn't have to follow the other parts of the law. But it wasn't what Jesus taught or Judas the Galilean. I'll usually use those names interchangeably, but
Right.
it wasn't what they taught, the Jews taught, and that's why they let him go. They turned their backs on him, and Paul even admits that. And in the Second Corinthians, Paul, even when he's in the latter part, he's talking about the super apostles, where he's talking about James and Cephas, and he essentially says that they're going to go to hell.
Yeah.
So you
Yep.
see the sheer hatred that Paul had for these people, and they weren't overly fond of him either because he was known as the liar, and
Right.
and there was a reason because he was twisting their words to make a name for himself. So that's the basics to know about Saul. There are a lot of in my book. I've got all the details of the passages that relate from Acts to Josephus, and how the timeline changes from Josephus to Acts. So
Right.
you can see the actual story versus the uh, the made up story in Acts. So
And that would also place the ministry of Jesus a little earlier in time.
yeah,
I bet.
it would place it probably as far back at the beginning to like 4 BC. With the
Yeah.
Golden Eagle Temple cleansing, there was a Judas and Matthias, who was probably his father, that um, cleansed the temple.
1 second.
Okay.
Okay, we're back. So,
All right.
yep.
Go ahead.
Uh, we were getting into Jesus' ministries earlier in time,
Right.
and you were talking about Judas and Matthias.
Yeah. And that was, you can read this in Josephus also. It was the Golden Eagle Temple cleansing. And this is right towards the end of Herod the Great's life. And so this is where Matthew puts the birth of Jesus. Okay. So in one account, this Judas was killed. In the other account, he doesn't mention anything. But then
Right.
in 2 BC, there was another Judas, the bandit, that
Yes.
that Josephus doesn't mention how he died either. And then in 6 AD, there's another Judas that led the tax revolt against Rome. And again, Josephus doesn't mention how he dies or anything. So I know Professor Eisenman thinks they're all the same person. I do too, because the Judas of 6 AD and the Judas of 4 BC had the same ideology. I
Yeah.
mean, they were teaching the same thing. So if it's two different people, it could have been doubted. But you have to remember there was a temple cleansing in 4 BC, and Jesus in the Gospels has a temple cleansing. In fact, in the Gospels, in John, he has a temple cleansing at the beginning of his ministry, and at the end. And in the other 3 Gospels, his temple cleansing is right before the crucifixion. So that's interesting that there were 2 temple cleansing. Now you look at Judas the Galilean. If his first temple cleansing was 4 BC, that was right at the beginning of his ministry. And then most likely when he actually was crucified by Pilate, it would have been similar to his son Menachem that went into Jerusalem in 66 AD, the same way that his father did. He goes in and declares himself Messiah. Well, what happened to him? He was killed, just like Judas the Galilean was probably killed. But Josephus doesn't mention it. The passage that everybody says was the passage about Jesus, and it is
Right.
placed in Josephus at right around 21 or 19 to 21 AD.
Hmm.
That was where you would expect to see Judas the Galilean's death. And even though Josephus says he's probably the most famous and uh, had the most followers, and there were zealots, and he even blamed the Jewish war on the followers of Judas the Galilean. Even though that, to our copies of Josephus today, there's no accounting for his death.
Yeah.
So I believe that the uh, testimonium about uh, Jesus was really originally about Judas the Galilean. That's
What
the only thing that makes that whole thing make sense.
do you tie that in with the hanging of Judas Iscariot? Uh,
I do, in that when we're looking at when the book of Mark was penned, um, Mark doesn't talk about the hanging of Judas Iscariot. The other Gospels do. And there's a possibility uh, the suicide, Judas, number one, Judas Iscariot is a fictional character.
yeah.
But what happens in 73 AD is you have the Sicarii go to Masada. The Romans are going to kill them all, and they all commit suicide. And that was in 73. So there's a good chance that the book of Mark was written somewhere between 70 and 73, because he does not mention the suicide of Sicarii, or quote unquote Judas Iscariot. But the other Gospels were written later, and that is now well-known history by then. So they include, the suicide.
And I can't help but say that it does somewhat, actually, a bit reminds me of the Gospel of Barnabas, which makes the assertion that Jesus was not crucified, but it was actually Judas that was. And Judas was mistaken for Jesus, for the 12 disciples were transformed to look like Jesus. It says something like that there.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, number one, the real name of Jesus was Judas. The gospel writers used that, and then used Judas Iscariot as the evil one.
yeah.
So they're trying to, because remember, Paul was up against Cephas and James, and Paul wanted to be the one that looked good. Cephas and James were supposed to be made to look not as good. Okay. In the Gospels, the negative portions of the Messiah are put onto Judas Iscariot. And then, he betrays Jesus, just like James and Cephas betrayed Paul in Antioch. So the Gospels are essentially a story where you've got a mixture of Paul and the exploits of Judas the Galilean mixed together. And at the end, the Pauline religion is what wins, because what happens in 70 AD, the Jews were wiped out by the Romans in the Jewish war.
Right.
The Jesus movement is gone. The only thing that's left is Paul's little groups of Gentiles. And then after the Jews are gone and nobody can hassle them anymore, they can start up a new religion, essentially using his teachings and the story of Judas the Galilean to make his Jesus Christ. So, that's my take on it.
Yeah, and I do find that interesting, because one could look at this like the Gospel of Barnabas, the hanging of Judas, and the later Gospels, as some kind of faint memory of Judas the Galilean being the one that was actually executed, and not Jesus. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I mean, Judas the Galilean was executed, and he was probably crucified. His two sons in 40, I think it was 44 or 46 AD,
Yeah.
They were crucified.
Simon and James.
Simon and James. And you look at all the similar names to what's in the gospel stories.
Yeah.
There are, in fact, there's a lot of the names, even in the gospel story, that are linked to the zealots. Simon the Zealot, Sons of Thunder, all these guys, they're all zealots,
Right.
and Judas was the leader of it. So when you look at that movement versus what Paul came up with, totally different.
Right.
You know, the Judas and his disciples were trying to actually throw off Roman rule, and they wanted to uh, essentially start their own kingdom there in Israel,
Right.
where Paul has no interest at all in that. He wants to make a name for himself amongst the Gentiles. So that's what we have today. We have the remnants of the Jewish religion, but it was overtaken by Paul's message to the Gentiles simply because they weren't around anymore. They got slaughtered,
Right.
Romans. And the last part of the slaughter was the story about Masada, where I think it was also his name was Eleazar. He was the
Mm-hmm.
grandson of Judas the Galilean,
Yeah.
and he is leading the people at Masada, and they fought the Romans as long as they could, and eventually they
Yeah.
decided to commit suicide.
It's that character called Eleazar ben Yar, whom is also called Eleazar ben Simon.
So
And that takes me to the next thing here about James the Just. I remember that you make a case, I think it was in Judas the Galilean, uh, that James the Just was the brother of Judas the Galilean. And I remember you bringing up Epiphanius of Salamis, whom said that James died when he was 96 years old.
right,
That would make his birth in 34 BC if it
he
was
died in
96, 62,
62.
right?
Right.
And I remember you using that as evidence as an indicator that James and Judas were brothers. But you want to get into that real quick?
Well, I mean, if you look at the birth, uh, the age of the gospel Jesus, he supposedly was born in 4 BC, or if you look at Luke, it's 6 AD, and he comes on the scene when he's 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But then when you look at James, and in the tradition was he was a very, very old man, whether he's 96 or 86 or whatever, he was old at the time of 62. So you take that back, let's say he's born somewhere between 30 and 20 BC. Good chance Jesus was either his older brother or they were very similar in age. Because Jesus or Judas is taking total, he's the number one person. So generally, he wouldn't be 30 years younger than James. He might be even a year or two older than James. So you take that, and then you look at the life of Judas the Galilean. Now he's in the temple cleansing in 4 BC. He's an adult. He's probably somewhere between maybe 20 years old, maybe even older. And then by the census, he's at least 30 years old. And it's interesting. If he's 30 years old, that means he was born around 25 BC, which is similar to what James would have been born, if you take that back 90 years or so. So, there's no one will ever know for sure, but it just under the current belief that Jesus was only 30 years old or was born in 4 BC, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right. Right.
So, this is much more consistent. Plus, then you have the idea that if Judas was born in 25 BC, which I did a little research, and I do have another book that's out that's like a companion to Judas of Nazareth. There was actually a celestial event that happened in 25 BC, which was much greater than anything that had happened, in 4 BC. That scholars have tried to find, constellations and comets and all sorts of
Mm.
things that would explain the Star of Bethlehem. But there was actually a big celestial event in 25 BC. So I put that in a companion book that
Yeah,
was 99 cents to get on Amazon.
yeah. I think I remembered something like that that you were discussing, and you used that as evidence that this is the original birth year. That 25 BCE is the original birth year of Jesus or Judas the Galilean.
Right. And I think that's probably in the ballpark by looking at all the other dates
Hmm.
of Judas throughout the Josephus' reporting on him.
And his father was Hezekiah. He was a rebel that fought
Well,
Herod the
that
Great.
might have been
Correct.
his grandfather
Hmm.
because he was killed at the beginning of Herod the Great. It could have been his father, could have been his grandfather. I don't know. That there are some things though, we'll never know. Matthias very well could have been Judas's father, could have been an older brother. I don't know, but I think he might have been the father.
Yeah, the way Josephus mentions Hezekiah, it's very the way he writes about him is a little vague.
Right.
It is weird. The text that talks about him might even feel a little. The timetable might even feel a little off there. Um, and that reminds me to the about the death contradiction that I know that you and Eisman both talk about. Uh, in which in one passage, I think it was in Jewish Wars, Josephus says that Judas and Matthew were burned together. And then in
Mm,
Antiquities, he for some reason mentions the same thing again, but leaves out the death of Judas and only mentioned Matthias.
right. So there's a good chance that what Herod they put one guy to death, or it was actually Archelaus that was ruling at that point, and
Hmm.
he's using the other person as a bargaining chip.
Hmm.
That's probably what happened because there was a release of prisoners too, which is your own the old like the Barabbas
Oh
type of
yeah.
prisoner release. There actually at the Golden Eagle there was a release of prisoners, and there
Hmm.
was also the tax issue came up then too. So there's a good chance that Judas would have been released, just like Barabbas was released,
Right.
son of the father
Hmm.
was released. If the father was killed, the son of the father, Barabbas, is released. But that would
Yeah.
have been in 4 BC after the death of Herod the Great.
And by doing that, it basically the crucifixion in the Gospels would be a combination of the Matthias Judas with the crucifixion of Judas in by 19 AD, 19 or 21 AD. Uh, and they like spliced them together. So that
Yeah,
would and that would move Matthew and Judas's trial before Herod like 20 or 30 years in the future, depending on the chronology.
right. So,
Yeah, we covered quite a bit in this so far. So I think the next thing I wanted to ask is basically when Pauline Christianity took over, and we have this news story. Jesus kind of portrayed as a God-man syncretism visionary of Paul turned pacifist in the Gospels, basically re- reversing messianism. Uh, Essentially, what I like about this is that um, Mark has Jesus saying, "Not one stone shall be left upon the other." It's kind of like what you're saying when that Judas the Galilean's followers were responsible for the war, therefore they were responsible for the destruction of the temple. It could be seen that way by the time Mark is written, and
mm-hmm,
and then Jesus predicting the fall of the temple is really Judas the Galilean starting the events that led up to the destruction of the temple. Essentially, is that pretty much the same? It's essentially the same thing you're saying in a way.
yeah, I mean, Josephus talks about, he's looking back at it and he's putting the blame on the fanatics that adhered to the philosophy of Judas the Galilean and Sadduc, who was the co-teacher, and that person, along with Judas the Galilean, was John the Baptist. And you could tie him in in the Slavonic Josephus. Uh, uh, John the Baptist is mentioned in 6 A.D. coming. In the Gospels, it's like 28 or 29 A.D. But in the Slavonic Josephus, John the Baptist is, or Sadduc. Sadduc is mentioned in 6 A.D. by Josephus when he discusses that the beginnings of this philosophy. But then the Slavonic Josephus also mentions a John the Baptist type that came in 6 A.D. So it's like they're coming in the same year, which totally contradicts the gospel timeline, but it ties directly Sadduc, who is Judas's co-teacher, with John the Baptist, and that's important because John the Baptist was according to the Gospels, it was the forerunner of Jesus, but in reality, he would have been the co-teacher. And when Judas the Galilean dies, who becomes the leader of the movement? It's Sadduc or John the Baptist.
Right.
And he lived until right around 36 A.D., which again flies in the face of the Gospels, who said that he died before Jesus.
It's like they
he
reversed
actually
it.
lived much longer than Judas the Galilean. And then when you look at James taking over, there's a passage, I can't remember what historian said, but he said that James ruled the church for 24 years. So he died in 62, and that would take that for 38, which would be about the time that we can say that the Council of Jerusalem was, when James is getting all the power together under him. And the only reason that occurred, it wasn't to discuss Paul's gospel. It was to discuss who's going to take over after John the Baptist dies. And he had died a few years before that. So the whole chronology of the New Testament is just totally out of whack, compared to the historians and especially Josephus that has presented.
Yeah, it's like John the Baptist is the actual guy that died in the AD 30s and not Jesus, and they reversed it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they had to get. They wanted to make John a small player, so he essentially is written out of the story.
Yeah.
As soon as Jesus comes on, he's arrested and then put to death.
Yeah.
Where Josephus talks about him being arrested, put in prison, and then killed, but it was in the mid-30s, late 30s, and that's supported by the Slavonic Josephus also. The dates of that.
And that takes me to the next thing, and then we're going to tie all this together. You mentioned that there's a problem with Pilate's chronology, like his reign. You want to get into that?
Sure. Traditionally, Pilate came in 26 and he ruled until 36 AD. Okay. Now, if you look at the chronology of the events that Josephus talks about, he mentions Pilate twice, but on either side of the events that he is talking about Pilate, it's 18. It's 18 AD, then he mentions Pilate, and we're supposed to believe it's 26, then he goes back to 18, and then he mentions Pilate again, so then it's supposed to be 26, and then afterwards we're back to 18. So it's like, if you look at it in chronology, Pilate came in 18. He came the same year that Caiaphas becomes high priest, and he became high priest in 18. There's also coin data that I put in my book that supports that theory also. The Pilate was there as early as 18. So he was there from 18 to 36 or 37. Now all the people had to do around 300 or so AD when they're messing with the writings of Josephus. The testimonium, almost every scholar agrees, was tampered with. I think it was Judas the Galilean. Some people say, oh, it was about Jesus, but somebody was tampering with it and changing the original meaning. But right before that, a few verses before that, it says that one of the, I think it was Gratus was there. It said he was there for 10 years. And that's how we get the dating of 26 for Pilate. Well, everybody before that was there for 3 years. So it's like if he was there for 3 years, then all of a sudden Pilate is coming in 18. So why people in the 4th century could tamper with that passage and not tamper with that little passage, the year amount for Gratus, nobody even talks about that. It's very, very, very possible that happened. The whole idea that Pilate had to become later, according to the later church, was there was something called the memorandum that was circulating in the early 4th century that said that Jesus was put to death under Pilate in the early 20s. Okay, and the church fathers did, Eusebius just thought that was crazy because, according to him, Pilate didn't come till 26, so he proved that wrong by that interesting date that is not consistent with the other passages around it. So I think there's a very good chance that Pilate came in 18. And I've got in my book, I've got it meticulously laid out. So it's, to talk about it, it might be somewhat confusing, but if you look at what I've laid out and you just get a copy of Josephus and start looking through it, you can see for yourself, the timeline for Pilate.
Yeah, the coin you were using had some kind of symbol on there that would have been used during the time of Pilate's reign. You said something like that.
Well, there was between 18 and I don't know if it was 31 or whatever. There was coins that were minted without lead, and they were eventually removed off the market because Pilate was such a onerous person that they tried to just remove everything associated with him. But if you look in Josephus, one of the things that one of his projects was to build an aqueduct. Now, I don't know, have you ever been to Pompeii?
No.
Okay, well, in Pompeii, they had aqueducts, and you can actually, to this day, see the lead pipe. You don't need lead to build an aqueduct because that works on gravity. But once it gets into town, all that water, you need to put it under pressure to take it to the rich people houses and for the baths and stuff. Well, you need lead for that. You need pipes. So there's a good chance that what Pilate did is he took that lead that was used for minting of coins as building to put into his building projects. So after the aqueduct and all that's built, then the coinage becomes normal again. So that's one thing that can possibly tie Pilate to a little earlier time.
So that would place his reign
from 18 to about 37 or so,
yeah,
instead of 26 to 37.
So basically this ties in together that there was a census by Quirinius. Well, it really starts with Herod the Great Herod the Great's ego being taken down, then the census of Quirinius, and that Judas the Galilean was rebelling at both times. um, that to organize his rebels, he founded the Sicarii, the fourth sect of Judaism, and he fought the Romans for quite some time. Then they finally caught up to him and had him crucified in about 19 or somewhere between 19 to 21 AD during the beginning years of Pilate's actual reign length. And John the Baptist then took over. Then after his death in 36, James the Just became the new righteous and took over from there until his death in 62. Then after his death, then Menahem, well, I forgot to mention Simon and James were crucified in 44 during all that time. Then
Right.
Menahem in 66, along with a bunch of other Jews, they start the Jewish revolt. And basically the sons of Judas the Galilean were major leaders, or if not the leaders, of the Jewish revolt against Rome, and including
Right.
Eleazar, who was his grandson. And after the rebellion was completely put down after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and then what was left of them was finished off in 73 with a massive suicide of the Sicarii. Paul, whom appears to have been involved with James' death, or at least shows up after James' death in 62, after he disappeared all that time, after the Council of Jerusalem in the 40s, was kicked out of the movement. He conjures up a pacifistic story, like he and his followers come up with a reverse messianism, and
Well, first of all, you need to look at where did Paul get his money from when he was preaching? He used Jerusalem as the center. He said, you need to give money so that we can give the money to the saints in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was the center of his fund collecting abilities. When
yeah,
Jerusalem's destroyed, he needs a new center for his religion. So
yes,
he kind of creates another thing, and people are giving money, but it's no longer to Jerusalem or to the temple. It's, then you have these power bases, whether, it was Antioch and Jerusalem and Rome, all these different power areas. Now, this took years and years. Paul probably started it and probably made a decent living at it, but then the people after that, and they were probably a lot of Herodians, were behind it. Good. They weren't making money off the temple anymore. They had to make
right,
another way to make a living.
right.
I do believe this is how they did it.
Yeah, and he's also the kinsman to the Herods, as he says in Romans, and Josephus says that Saul was a kinsman to the Herods too, and so was his brother Costobarus. Anyway, that would be another way he could have gotten some of that too for Herodian help. But yeah, that's pretty much. I guess that's how it all ties in together there. Pretty nicely, it does tie it
Yeah,
nicely.
and
Yeah.
one other story that your listeners might be interested in. Um, in the book of Acts, Paul goes to see Agrippa II, and he also says, "I appeal to Rome," and he goes to see. He wants
Mm-hmm.
to see Caesar. Okay, the Saul the Herodian and Josephus went to Agrippa and asked for troops to put down the rebellion against Judas's
Yeah.
followers, and then later went to meet Nero in Greece. And this was after Nero had kicked his pregnant wife in the stomach and essentially killed her.
Right.
Saul was meeting with Nero. That was the Caesar that he was chumming up to. So it paints a totally different picture than the sanitized version in Acts.
It
know.
sure does. Yeah. 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 That was we covered quite a lot here. Um, I think one more thing I'm curious about is Theudas, the guy that got beheaded in about 44 AD,
Uh,
uh, who was baptizing at the Jordan River. He had his followers organized at Jordan River like John the Baptist. Did you say? I think you said somewhere in either Judas the Galilean or another book think it was Judas the Galilean, that you think Judas was a junior of Judas the Galilean, correct?
Very well could have been. I mean, if you
Mm,
look at some of the names like uh, Thaddeus and Judas that are in the apostle list, if you combine, Thomas, you combine those, you can come up with Thaddeus. The being having his head cut off and beheaded is similar to one of the stories in Acts also, because Acts takes these characters
mm,
and whether it's uh, James was beheaded, well, that was probably taken from the beheading of Judas. So these were probably in the history of the movement. These were important people.
yeah.
They've been twisted almost beyond recognition in the Book of Acts and in the Gospels. So
Yep.
yeah, very well. He probably could have been a son of Judas the Galilean. Very, very, very likely he was.
Well, all right. I think we covered the basis. I really like what you're saying because it's it makes a lot of sense that it was from Judas the Galilean that the zealot characters in the New Testament are based on. They're all associated with him. That Jesus is pretty much a cleaned up rebel, and John the Baptist is also heavily cleaned up. Kind of, John the Baptist is like the New Testament John the Baptist is like a pacifistic combo of
He's a
Judas,
holy man.
yeah,
Yeah.
of Judas and John himself. Uh, and Paul just and his followers just did a lot of cleaning up. a lot,
Yeah.
yeah,
By the time Acts was written, Paul probably was long gone, but
right,
I think he was very instrumental in helping with the composition of Mark, because we know Saul was alive in 66 AD when he was with
right,
Nero.
right.
So that would, the composition would have been within a few years of that. And there's no reason to think that Saul wasn't around anymore at that point. Plus, he needed to make a living. And
Right, sure did.
if you look at what Paul did even in the Gospels, he collected a lot of money from a lot of people, and he was going to continue that after the war. And this was one of the ways he did it. Was through and it was kind of brilliant, but kind of deceitful at the same time.
That makes sense.
You know.
Well, all right. Thank you. Thank you for coming on. This was a really good conversation. Uh, and it's Judas the Galilean being the historical Jesus. I it it is really fascinating, and the amount of parallels between the two. There's a lot of parallels between those two. A lot of parallels. And I remember you mentioning Simon and James. His sons were kind of inverted into becoming his brothers in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
While James the Justice, even though he's actually his brother anyway, it's like a I don't know combo like James the Less and James the Great, things like that. But yeah, I can see that. I can see that.
And Judas was married where Jesus is celibate his whole life.
Yeah.
So there's uh, a movement there to take a person that is fully human and making him more like
Yeah.
somebody that's kind of unusual.
And before we end this, one more thing I almost forgot to ask is, do you think Paul combined his visionary Jesus with Judas the Galilean, and why? Why do you think he did it?
Well, I think at the time, now you got to remember, we're looking at it 2,000 years ago,
Right.
2,000 years later. At the time, everybody in the Roman Empire would have known about Judas the Galilean and his followers.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you read some of the later historians talking about the Great Fire at Rome, and they're talking about the persecutions of the Christians, you can see that those people were essentially the Jewish zealots. That they would take all sorts of abuse, and they would not succumb to any type of pressure from the Romans. So they were well known throughout the empire, not loved, but well known. And to take that, you can't just erase history so easily. It's easier sometimes to bend history a bit.
Right.
And what he did is he bent it, and you talk to groups that aren't real familiar. So he's talking to Gentile groups in particular. This is who the message is going out to. And those people aren't as well versed in the history of it. He's taking this historical character, changing him, making his beliefs are being intertwined with that Messiah's beliefs, and you have a new creature at that point, which is wholly acceptable to people that believe the things that were believed in the pagan world at that time. He was a sacrifice and this and that, and very unlike what Judas actually was. He was a messianic figure that would lead the Jews over Rome.
Right.
As opposed to Paul's figure was, he died for your sins, and now you can be redeemed through that blood. So, and then especially like the book, the Gospel of Luke is really hitting on themes with the cult of Mithras, to try to bring them into their new religion. So, I spell it out in my book, each one of the Gospels, who it was aimed at. And, it was very good marketing. And then thousands of years later, here we are, and most people believe it. And then, the old, it's gospel truth. They believe everything in it.
Right.
But at the beginning, it was a wholesale change to I think, just to make money.
Right. Yeah, Paul really thought it through. Like he cleaned him up, reversed messianized the character, and turned him into a Hellenized, Judeo-Hellenized, dying, rising God. Yeah.
And the evil person was Judas Iscariot.
Right.
Iscariot, Sicarios,
Right. Sicarii. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Those were the evil ones.
And that's how they, and that's how they tied it all up together, and leading up to modern Christianity. Yep.
Yep. We're at the same place they were when Paul did this.
Yep. Well, this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Yeah. We should probably do this again later.
Get some more questions, or if anybody that listens to your program has any questions, and write them down, and we'll go over do some more. Because there are so many things we didn't touch on. A lot of the details. Sometimes it's in the details that can really open your eyes, and say, well, this is beyond belief.
Exactly.
We've just kind of touched on some of the big things, but there are a lot of smaller points that also support what I'm saying here.
Yep. All right, everyone. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share this video. And if any of you have questions, please post them in the comment section below. This will help me get a new video out in the future, in the next interview. But anyway, thanks for watching, and thank you for joining me again, Daniel Unterbrink.
You're welcome.
And I will see all you later.